inscribió a los premios. Este año ha vuelto a ser el primer caso inscrito en esta edición. Está claro que tienen claro que es un caso eficaz y que tiene que competir. Yo creo que en otras agencias, otros anunciantes tienen un debate interno, pero ellos lo tienen muy claro y ha sido muy bueno. Os voy a presentar al siguiente ponente que viene de Londres y es un lujo tenerle aquí. Quiero agradecer mucho toda la ayuda que nos presta la APG. José Manuel Zamorano ha hablado de ellos a la hora de revisar y reinventar los premios en esta 15ª edición y ha sido magnífico el trabajo que han hecho, ayudarnos a revisar categorías, criterios de evaluación, ponderación de criterios y nos hayan ayudado también a que hoy John esté con nosotros. John es autor de, entre otras publicaciones, de un libro que se llama Made With, The Emerging Alternative to Western Brands. John ha sido cofundador y es Head of Strategy en una agencia de Londres muy exitosa que se llama St. Luke, y tiene una amplia experiencia trabajando en Estados Unidos, en Europa, en América del Sur y en Asia. Y va a compartir con nosotros casos que invierten mucho en comunicación y casos que invierten menos. Va a ser una exposición muy interesante. John, thank you for being with us. It's a great pleasure. I'm sure we will all enjoy your presentation.
Hola, buenos días. That's all of my Spanish, so very sorry. Good. Effectiveness Awards. I started working in advertising in London in the 1980s, and there were no blogs, there was no YouTube, there was very little international sharing of ideas, at least at the level that I was. And the one thing I learned from actually was effectiveness studies. They started in London in 1982, and it was the only place you could learn the simple question, how does it work? Of course, you learn as a junior planner, you learn, oh, I have to make a target audience, or I have to make a proposition, but it doesn't really teach you how it works. You learn how to write a brief, but you learn perhaps later a little bit more overview, how business works, how brand works, how society works, and how it all fits together. And I learned even more about how it works when I started to write effectiveness papers and not just read them, and I did this in the 1990s and I had some successes. And later, since then, I have written a number of books. This is number 6 that I just finished, actually. This isn't published. I have a publisher which is actually Spanish, a very international group, and it is out in, I think, July. Now, very simply, in Spanish terms, actually, last time I was here, I spoke at Alimentaria, the fantastic food festival, and I know food in Spain is something that is not necessarily in the UK or America or some other places I've been, and I think brands and marketing are like food. It's ultimately a very cultural subject. It's quite universal. Everywhere has food, everywhere has restaurants, everybody has mothers who cook in a certain way that you remember when you're an adult, and it's a very cultural thing. And it is the same, but it is also very different. If I take you to Tehran and we eat food, then there is no jamon, no alcohol, but still you will recognise many of the rituals and the customs of food. And I'm going to be talking about some recipes. We heard before, strategy, idea, execution, results. It's very much like cooking. You have a restaurant, you have recipes, you have cooking, the performance in the night, and then you have the food. It's a very similar thing, and I think you learn from reading cookbooks, I think you learn from case studies. So all I have today is some stories, very many of which, for brands you never heard of, because they're from, this was my interest, they're from the emerging world, not the developed world, not the West. I'm not here to talk to you about the marketing of iPad, or the next iGenius idea from Apple. And I gave a title 2 weeks ago. I have a responsibility for a title, which is from Plato, Necessity is the Mother of Invention. And I know there's been a lot of controversy and discussion about some of the titles of the conference, for me, necessity is the key strategy word. Necessity is born out of human needs. Necessity is about truth. That's what Plato meant as much as needs. It's actually about human truth and getting to something true. But there is also a situation, there is something, there is a context which drives it forward. I will talk about some people who've made some brands in some countries where they don't have much resources, with almost nothing, and I will also talk about some very, very, very expensive big ideas, and it's just a selection of interesting recipes. And I think together, like the cooking, they're a little bit alternative to the way that we cook. I think Spain is much closer to these examples, actually, than America and the Anglo-Saxon model. I think there's something more cultural, but there's more of the tradition left in the brands in these countries. Right, the clicker, good, it works. So Jim O'Neill came up with a very famous idea in 2001 called the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And he published this, and everybody said, you're crazy. This will, you know, people invest in America, they invest in high tech, the internet was booming. Who wants to look at Brazil, Russia, India, China? And of course, they have grown like anything, more than his predictions. 2005, he came up with another idea called the Next 11, Pakistan, Nigeria, Indonesia, Turkey, Korea, again, which have grown even faster. Those countries have grown faster than, for instance, China and India in that recent time. And he said, I'm starting with 9/11, he published his paper about the BRIC economies 1 month after 9/11. He worked in New York and London, and he was very, like everybody, shaken by that. But he said that was the moment when he realized that globalization would not mean Americanization, that actually other cultures will grow, and as they grow, they will bring their own ideas, their own confidence, so in our case, their own way of branding. And we have always seen this. We have seen, for instance, the Japanese, since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, bring a very different sensibility to brands. They brought us Sony, Muji, Izumiyaki. They are like our brands, but they're different, and they have a very charismatic difference that comes out of the Japanese traditions, and also their love of futurism and technology and modernity. And so it's more of the same, but there are some very new countries joining this list. Here is the funny thing about emerging markets, is that we have to stop using that word next year, because in 2014, the emerging markets in GDP, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will be bigger than the developed countries. So we need a new term, maybe emerged markets. And here is Orhan Pamuk. He's one of my favourite novelists. He is a Turkish writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think about 5-6 years ago. And he created a very interesting museum in Istanbul, which is also a book. And the museum and the book are both about these objects of everyday life, and the way to understand these little trinkets, gift-giving, tickets from a concert, mementos. And at that time he wrote this: the economic growth we have seen in non-Western countries over the last 10 years is enabling the emergence of a new generation of humanity, both modern and non-Western. And that's the key to everything I will show you. It is both modern and non-Western, whose stories I'm sure will soon feature regularly in the literature we read, which they will, because they're in my book. Now, I start very broad, and then we get down to some case examples. So let's start very broad with a very big brand called the West. And the West has a very distinct idea of itself, and it is a geography idea. If there is a West, there must be an East. But it's also the West of the Wild West of America, the frontier. And it really carries forward that idea that we've had in the West since the Renaissance, that there is here and now, there is a frontier, and beyond that there is chaos, and everything is progress. We move into this void, this vacuum, and now we move with digital, with sustainability, with all these new themes, with financial services. we're always moving into this new frontier. So we're grounded in the idea